Welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing The Battle of Hastings, The Fall of the Anglo-Saxons, and the Rise of the Normans by Jim Bradbury. This is a military history describing one of the most important or influential battles in English history, the Battle of Hastings, which took place in 1066. And in this book review, I'm going to be discussing what was covered in this book, what I liked about this book, and give you an opportunity to provide your feedback. Have you read this book, or do you have any thoughts on this book? If so, please leave it in the comment section down below because I love to receive your comments. So let's dive into Jim Bradbury's book. So as many of you know, 1066 Battle of Hastings was a turning point in English history. Prior to 1066, we have the influence of the Anglo-Saxons who had a Germanic background, and following 1066, we have an increase in Norman influence through William the Conqueror, the victor of the Battle of Hastings, which led to Norman influence in English, not only the landmass of England, but also on the English language. English is a Germanic language, but has heavy French influence, and of course my understanding from this is that that was from the Norman invasion. So 1066 is a turning point, and the war that changed everything in 1066 was this Battle of Hastings. The subtitle here kind of summarizes what happened, the fall of the Anglo-Saxons and the rise of the Normans. So we already know the outcome, although the outcome shouldn't be a surprise. This is a history book and not necessarily a novel. But to give you some background on what happened and what led up to 1066, we have two key players and then one person who maybe didn't manage his demise very well. The first is the eventual victor of the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror. William is Norman and spent a lot of time pre-1066 securing his position in Normandy. The author takes time before getting to the actual battle to discuss both William the Conqueror and Harold Godwinson, who are the two key players in this story. He first starts with the Normans. Who were they? Where did they come from? And discuss a lot about what William had done to shore up his position. So by the time 1066 comes around, William had kind of taken care of a lot of business on the continent and was in a good place to invade England. But it wasn't just an invasion that he wanted to do. When things came down to it, William thought that he had a claim on the English throne. The other key player in the Battle of Hastings was Harold Godwinson. So the Godwins were a family that had some contentious relationship with the king. At least from my reading of all these books at this time, there may have been a king at this point. It was Edward the Confessor, but there were also a lot of powerful nobles and other families that could really make life difficult for the king. It wasn't like the king had complete and absolute control over his subjects at all times. If the people who were at the Thane level, for example, disagreed, they could make life quite difficult for the king. Harold Godwinson was a distant relative of Edward the Confessor, who was the king at the time that this crisis kicked off. Well, not quite. Edward the Confessor kicked off this crisis by basically not having an heir. He was known to be quite pious, if my understanding is correct, but he didn't have an heir and he didn't make clear who he wanted to succeed him on the throne when he died, which caused a succession crisis because without having a son, there was no clear heir. And so without firmly naming an heir, the idea of who was going to rule next started to become a problem. Now, there is some belief in history that both Harold and William the Conqueror both believed they had been given a promise and may have been given a promise at one time that they were going to be the ones who were going to inherit the throne. However, there is a difference in opportunity when Edward the Confessor dies. Harold is there and present and can take the throne, while William is still back in Normandy. So Harold takes the throne. Harold Godwinson gets to work. He is the King of England, and he does rule for a couple months in 1066 before the battle comes to a head. I think something that maybe people don't always recognize about Harold is that he had some success initially, and one of the most important things he did was actually reduce the number of competitors for control of England. So this is on page 104. There was a battle called Stamford Bridge where he defeats a Scandinavian invasion who also had a claim or were trying to get their hands on the English throne. So he says, in the long run, Stamford Bridge had important consequences. Stamford Bridge is when Harold defeated the Norwegian contingent, a Scandinavian contingent for control. In the long run, Stamford Bridge had important consequences. It narrowed the field of competitors for control of England to two, and it did much to shift England away from Scandinavian threat, which had dogged it for a long period. And this period extends all the way back, well, probably further back than this, but I know that Ethelred the Unready had a long history with the Viking invasions, and by winning Stamford Bridge, which was a key battle Harold won in his reign, his very short reign, he showed that he could hold on to England and he could defeat, well, for the time, he could hold on to England and he could defeat another invading force. And again, as mentioned here, the Scandinavians never were able to, that threat was kind of shifted away after this time. That was implied here on page 104. So I think that some people think that Harold just, I don't know, they don't always recognize all of the military achievements that he did do. However, Williams believes that he had received a promise to the throne, and there is some conversation on whether or not Harold had actually promised William the throne as well. So William decides to come over. I think William also at this point was William II in Normandy, but he was not William II in England yet, he was just William. And so he comes over in October and engages in the Battle of Hastings, which is the deciding battle. The winner of this battle is the one who's going to be able to retain control of England. So Harold decides he's going to come back. Well, come back. He's going to take over. So Harold wants to maintain his position. He's already beat the Scandinavian contingent. William comes over, William sets up, and they engage at Hastings. One thing I do like about military history, and I'm not a huge fan of military history though, there are some benefits, and one of them are these diagrams. So I love the fact that these diagrams are included. There's charts, there's diagrams, there's maps of what happened, and this makes it really easy for me to visualize. So I do have to say I very much appreciate the different diagrams that were included in this book explaining what happened on that day. This, however, brought up many, many memories of sitting through American history, Civil War, and then we had these videos from the 1980s, it felt like, where there was these little block diagrams, and then General Sherman's going here. Those, I think that cemented my dislike of military history, although this book was quite entertaining and I did like it. But we have these little ranks showing what happened. This is everything I disliked about American history. Was learning about where all these little things were, but if you like military history, I'm sure things like this are interesting. And while these might bore me a little bit, these I find very, very helpful, and I really appreciate it. The author spends a lot of time discussing maybe where things happen, the kind of equipment, military equipment, styles of fighting that were used between the Saxons and the Normans, what differed, what was the same, and that's all discussed in this book in the military history aspect of it. And again, I'm not a huge military history person. I don't dislike it, but I don't gravitate towards it. So some of the stuff about the very specifics of how the shields were used was less interesting to me, but if you're a military history fan, I can see that you love that section. I read it, it was fine, it just isn't what I gravitate towards. But the Battle of Hastings occurs, and in that Harold falls. And this is kind of the key point. When a leader falls, then there's kind of this power vacuum, and also two other high-ranking individuals were also killed during this fight. We see this also in the Bayeux Tapestry. I do have a book review of that on my channel. Very, very fascinating tapestry which shows what happened in the Battle of Hastings and William's conquering. So William wins the battle, but I think the author did a good job by showing that just because he won the Battle of Hastings doesn't mean the conquering is over. So he wound up having to chase down people and having to defeat other groups of people before he could truly unify England or take control of England. So just because he won one battle doesn't mean everyone just capitulated at that point. He had to continue to work to maintain his control of England throughout the remainder of the year and for a time after that. But William eventually does take control, and this brings about a number of changes. It's the end of the Anglo-Saxon influence, and there's also a now Norman influence coming into England, which is going to change the language. It changes the ruling class. It changes the who's in charge, what families are in charge, different customs. So it's a massive overhaul, a massive change, and a massive turning point in history. So even people who aren't familiar with history normally know a couple key dates, and one of those tends to be 1066, the Battle of Hastings, due to the massive impact that it had on English history. So this book was very, very interesting. It is a military history, but I found it very readable and enjoyable as someone who doesn't particularly enjoy military history. I think it does a good job of showing that the conquest was just a one-day event and that the Battle of Hastings didn't take place in a vacuum. There was a lot of details leading up to it, and the author spent a lot of time discussing how the Normans got to their point, how William got to his point, and how Harold Godwinson got to his point and what he was doing, and the successes Harold did have before meeting William on the field in the Battle of Hastings in 1066. There's a lot in this book that parallels another book I read called The First Kingdom by Max Adams. There's a lot of discussions about things like heightage, place names, people, texts, locations, authors that are mentioned that were covered in a really comprehensive way in the book The First Kingdom by Max Adams. I have a book review of that on my channel and it will be linked at the end of this video. So I think that book discusses the sub-Roman Britain period, which is when the influence of these Anglo-Saxons grew. And because 1066 kind of marks the end of a strong Anglo-Saxon influence in, not that they just disappeared, but we had an increased Norman influence at that point. I think reading The First Kingdom and having that background knowledge made me understand the influence and how the Anglo-Saxons came to be, the different texts that were being used. It was just very helpful. So if you like this book and want to know more about the Anglo-Saxon world, I will link my book review of The First Kingdom, and you might want to check out that book as well. If you've read this book or have any thoughts or comments, please leave it in the comment section down below. I love to receive it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.